Untangible Thoughts, here for another installment of the Imagination Instructional Series. Today we're going to be doing a custom Timberland, or any suede boot really, but we're working with Timberlands today. And we're going to be doing it with a wood burner. Now, in terms of supplies, you can get these wood burners at any arts and crafts store. They come with multiple tips. That's the good thing about these, but they do burn out kind of quickly. We got a couple of options today. We also have a precision wax tool, which comes with various tips as well, so you can get different shapes. And the good thing about this, the wax tool, is that it has a dial on the front so you can control the temperature. The actual wood burner doesn't have a dial like that, but they actually do sell at Radio Shack the dials that you can get, and you can plug it in through the dial and control your temperature that way. But I'm going to show you how to do it both with the regular wood burner without the heat control and with the wax tool. For little accents, I also like to use the trio markers. They work on the boots almost like watercolor on watercolor paper. So I have a little of the trio marker fluid to paint kind of free form, and then I have the neutral gray set to go in and do some detailing with. Now, neutral gray works good on these boots because as you work into the boot, the neutral gray shows up brown on here, and it mimics the same tones as the burning that you created. You need a light table, or a lot of times if I don't have a light table available, you can hold an image up against a window and trace on the other side. There's a lot of ways to do it, but a light box definitely helps. Alright, today what we're doing is an Obama boot. So, this is the raw boot. You don't need to do anything to treat it. If you have an old boot, you might want to clean it up with a new butt cleaner. But out the box, they're ready to go. Now, the image we're doing of Obama, starting with this image right here. So here we have the Obama portrait that we're using as our reference, and what you want to do is, I mean, any image that you're using as reference, you can lay down on your light box. You trace all of the dark areas where you want a line to be on the boot, just to kind of mark your space. You don't want to cover all the darks because you don't want to muddy up your boot with the graphite from the pencil. So you want to keep it minimal and kind of hit the contour lines and the outlines, so that you leave yourself space to work with the wood burner. So I've already gone ahead and traced the back of this portrait. But I want to try and incorporate a few more style elements. So we have some pictures of the White House, and those will be the two structured elements of our boot. And then I'm going to freehand American flag kind of draping around the front of the boot. So we'll give you something really structured and something a little more freehand and loose, so you get a feel for both. Alright, so we're just going to do the same thing with this one. Trace out all the darkest spots, being careful not to cover too much of the image. Let's see, then you end up with something like this. You always want to check it from the back and make sure that you've covered all the major areas, so you don't have anything that you think you traced and you didn't. Now, after this, you're going to cut it out. You want to take away as much of the paper as you can so you can really see where you're placing it on the boot. Also, as another tip, you should always have more than one copy of the image you're doing if you're doing the tracing, because the copy that you trace over is going to be all muddied up by the pencil and you're not going to be able to see it. So you want to have another image another copy of the same image, larger, so you can see the detail. If your printer has, you can print it on better paper. So this will be my working reference when I move on after I've done the tracing. You want to cover your image in tape, preferably as clear as you can get it. I didn't have any completely clear tape, so we're working with a kind of tinted brown, but as long as you can see your image, you'll be fine. And there's two reasons for the tape. One is to actually hold it on the boot while you're tracing, or help you hold it on the boot. And the other is to give the paper a little more strength so that you don't dig holes in it with the pencil and mess up your boot. You want to pay attention to where you're placing it before you place it, because the graphite is going to start to rub off on the suede immediately. So you want to make sure that you just place it down once, exactly in the spot where you want it to be. For doing the tracing, I usually like to use the higher B pencils, so anything from a 4B up. But sometimes, you get stuck using a number 2 pencil. You just have to press a little harder. Once you've placed your image down, you want to take the pencil and you want to go over all the lines you made, tracing it on the other side. When you're initially doing your tracing on the light box, you want to make sure you hit points that are key points in the image, so that when you're doing this pressing from the other side, you don't miss them. Now I chose to keep the microphone in this picture just for the composition, because I'm going to be bringing things down and around the front. You should always be aware of the composition of the boot when you choose your images, and when you place your images down, when you print them out to the size that you want them. You should always be aware of where things are going to fall on the boot. Now, in this case, I'm doing the portrait. I definitely didn't want any of the detailed features of the face to run over the stitching. And I didn't want anything to be cut off by the rivets, so I placed the majority of the face in the clean open side. Now that might not look like enough to go on, but it's pretty good. When you use the softer pencils, you get a bolder image, but this is good enough to work from. While you're finishing up tracing the image on the boot, you should plug your tools in so they start to get hot. That way, as soon as you're done tracing, you can get started burning. I can always tell when this one's getting to the right temperature by the fact that it starts to give off a little smoke. Now I'm just gonna test kind of in an area that I know I want to go dark on, just to see how hot the burner is actually. You just want to touch the surface lightly, and that way you can gauge how hot the burner is and how long you can hold it on the surface before you get the desired color. When I say desired color, you're limited to shades of brown with the burning on this color boot, well, on any color boot. As you burn the suede, it's going to turn a dark brown. That's why I choose to use this color boot, because I think the contrasting color looks best on it. But if you had a light gray boot, it would still burn brown. With this tip, you can get a very fine line, but you want to be careful. Remembering to always move quickly. Alright, see there, I made a mistake. It's a good thing because I get to show you how to cover up those mistakes. That line wasn't intended to be that dark at that point. So I want to just come in lightly and fade out. When you're working with the small tip, the only ways you can really do the shading is with stippling or forms of cross hatching. You can play around with both for different effects. Now, it helps to think of this same way you would think of a pen, where, yeah, the mark is down once you've made it, but you can work subtly to make adjustments. And the strokes are pretty similar to an ink pen, whereas you have to move quickly to get all the subtleties you want. Now, if you notice the marks you're making are a little too dark, or you feel that it's burning before you get a chance to really move your hand quick enough, with the wax tool you can just turn down the temperature. What I sometimes do with the wood burner is just unplug it for a second. And then once you unplug it, you can continue to work with it as it cools down. Working this way, you can get a lot of subtle tones that you couldn't get with the tool plugged in on high all the time. Now I'm going to show you how to use the wax tool while we have the other wood burner just cooling off for a while. This wood burner goes from 0 to 100. Alright, we're going to turn the power on first. Then we're going to turn this up to start with 80. I've worked with this before, so I know that 80 is a good temperature. Now the tip that I'm using is flattened out, and it's got a nice rounded edge. It's going to help me do some of this hair texture. I want to be careful because some of these get hot in places you wouldn't expect them to get hot. Like this screw here warms up a little bit. So you want to just make sure you don't burn yourself. And this is one of the benefits to the wax tool. You can control the temperature so you can keep it at the right temperature longer. You do quite a bit of shading between this tip and the fact that I can turn the temperature up and down. You can get lots of subtle, I would say subtle grays, but subtle browns. Don't be afraid to experiment with your tools. You know, get an old pair of boots and see what you can do. Sometimes with the temperature down and the tip cool with a sharp edge like this, you can lift back into the image, almost like sandpaper. But I'm not using that for any of these effects on this boot. So the great thing about this wax burner and this tool in particular is just all the subtleties you can get. When you use it flat and kind of brush the surface, you can get lots of subtle brown tones, almost like you're working with charcoal. And then as we move on into the hair, you can just allow the shape to create some of the different types of marks that you need. Now, you just want to play around. Try and get as many different kind of marks as you can that look like what you see in the image. It'll help with the entire illusion. You still want to make sure in this portrait that we're giving the subtle differences of like the black and the gray in Obama's hair. So I'm kind of creating to a mid-tone and then allowing myself to go a little bit darker. get to the darkest parts of the hair, I've turned the temperature up to 90 on that dial, and that's giving me a dark enough burn. I think it's very helpful when doing hair to go with the grain, observe which way the grain goes. You can see the grain of the hair, and then even if you want to fade that out at points, if you make all your marks in those directions, it'll help with the illusion that it's real hair. You'll find if you create any kind of a texture, you can get a darker burn than if you just hold the flat part against a broad area. And it also helps you with fading out. Alright, so once you have your background penciled in, I'm going to show you how to use the markers to achieve the blends. We sketched an American flag here, just from a reference. And I'm going to use warm gray number 3 to just start laying in the darker parts of the flag. Alright, so I'm going to start off with Tria neutral gray number 3. Want something kind of light so we can judge how dark it is, because you can always go darker, but once you go too dark, it's very hard to relighten the boot up. You can do it with a suede brush or an electric eraser or even a regular eraser, but it starts to damage the suede, and you can tell the difference. So try and use that sparingly. Now, as you apply the marker, it's going to appear very dark to start off with, darker than it dries to. That's why you want to start with a slightly lighter color than you think you're going to need, so you can judge what color it dries to. And with the markers, you want to work quickly and block in your areas fast, because the more you let it dry and go back over it, the darker it's going to get, and it's going to always leave marks in the direction of the marks you made. Now going back to my Obama reference, I want to make sure I'm not going too dark where I need to put the details at the bottom of the hand. Now, markers give you much more control once you get used to them. You can fade things out almost like watercolor. Now I'm going to show you a slightly different technique where I'm going to drip the actual marker fluid. Ooh, see, that's what we want to try and avoid. Now I'm just using the fluid to build up a block of color. And keep it kind of loose. Ooh. I'm going to go back in with a number 2 gray and blend into the color I dripped. So much darker than the color it's supposed to be. That's never good. Now I'm just darkening the background to enhance the illusion of the flag, as well as bringing some of that light that you see in the reference. And in order to show light, you have to have shadow next to it, contrast. So I have to bring all these darks up and leave the color of the boot as the highlight. Alright, so I'm just laying in some of the rough details of the White House with the same gray I used as the darkest part of the flag so far. I'm just going in, laying in the darkest parts.
Yeah.
If you notice with the markers, to get the lighter color, you need a higher number. So think these go up to 9, neutral gray 9, which is the lightest color before you get to the blender. And then we have pure black and the blender are basically the opposite. So pure black would be your white, and it somewhat lifts the color that you've laid down. So you want to test your colors on a piece of paper just to know, you know, how it corresponds to the color you've used before it. So I want to go in with a neutral gray. Oh no, mistake I made before. I want to go in with a neutral gray 7. Right. You want to make sure when you're working with the markers that you work fairly quickly, because any area that dries is going to leave a mark and an edge that'll be very hard to get rid of. So now that we've gotten a little color into the white of the flag, I'm going to go in with the number 5, which is a little bit, it's a little bit lighter than the blue, but it should still be considerably darker than the white is now. And we still have the wood burner to go in at the end with and really give it its darkest darks. No, yeah, I guess you can. Some finish out this part.
Okay.
Now, as I'm laying in my strokes, I'm continuing to go over the parts that I want to be a little bit darker, so that the flag will have a little bit more texture to it. This section right here in the white, to me, is a little bit too dark, so I'm going to go in with the blender and kind of fade it out. Now, don't worry that it looks like it's getting darker. All the parts where it's darker now is going to dry lighter. And that'll finish off the part I'm going to do with the markers. And I'm going to finish it off with the wood burner. Alright, now I have the wood burner set to 70, which should give me a nice line and shouldn't burn too quickly. I like the fact that most of the White House is kind of misty, so I'm just going to go in and accentuate just the darkest parts. Now it's just barely burning it at this point. I'm just kind of marking off the area that I want to burn. I'm going to turn up the heat just a little bit to 80. Now it's getting to the temperature that it needs to be, and it's starting to scorch the surface a little faster. This way I can keep my hand moving and just lightly darken the areas I want to darken by tapping it very lightly and quickly and kind of dragging it as you lift it off. Now this is really starting to get it to a good temperature where, and because I was working so lightly, it allows you to gauge what the temperature is and see just how long you can let the metal sit on the surface to get the color you desire. And I don't want to overwhelm the stuff in the foreground, so I want to keep this all kind of soft. Now, in order to achieve a soft effect like this, you have to work very lightly, just barely grazing the surface. It's almost like a stippling technique you would use with a pen. When you're practicing on an old boot or something, you might want to just take the time to practice making straight lines, making little box shapes, different shapes, filling it in, and just practicing your fades on an old boot so that when it comes time to do a portrait or any of these things, you have all these different techniques to fall back on. When you're building up these darkest areas, you want to make sure you keep your hand moving all the time. You don't want to let the tool just sit in an area and build up too much heat, because there's a point where it goes as dark as it can and then it just starts to burn the surface to the point where it's like a charcoal almost, and it starts to discolor at that point. So you want to make it just dark enough, and always keep your tool moving quickly. Alright, so for the flag, I don't want to really do too much to it because I like the tones I have with the markers, so I'm just going to go in with the burner, kind of accentuate the lines I have. And at this point, if you can still see any pencil lines, you want to try and hide those with the burning. be very careful when you're working this close to the sole that you don't touch this to any of the rubber. Now, you can cut across these little stitches, but the more you do that, the more you weaken the shoe. So when it's not really necessary for the image, I just kind of tap in between. And I mean, it's alright if you burn it slightly, but if you just keep cutting through all of them, it can be too much. And what I'm doing here is just accentuating the stars slightly. I want to do a little bit less with each one so that they kind of go back in space. Now, just for fun, I'll probably just throw in a little cross hatching. Well, at least some line work. Let's not say cross hatching, but line work. Alright, so I finished with the wood burn and I decided to go back in with the markers for one last detailing. Felt like the shadows in Obama's clothing weren't quite strong enough. So rather than go in and try and burn these, I'm just gonna go over them lightly with the marker, going down to a number 2, So this is like the darkest of the markers I've used here. Alright, so here we have the finished boot with all the values pushed to where I think they should be. Andre Trenier of Tangible Thoughts. You've been watching Tattooing the Boot by Your Imagination.